Well, in these videos we've been thinking about the idea of how to be more gospel fluent, how to speak the language of the gospel into everyday lives. We've recommended that you read Jeff Vanderstolt's book, Gospel Fluency. That will certainly help you in this area. But what we've also been talking about is how you might develop this better. We've mentioned some of the issues and problems that we face in developing gospel fluency, including our own story getting in the road, including the kind of circumstances we find ourselves in. But we've also talked about how you might start to address these things. We've mentioned the idea of growing in your knowledge of the gospel, coming to a deep understanding of what that means. We've also talked about the idea of developing a skill and perhaps meeting with other people and practicing conversations which are more gospel-centered in the way you go about them. I mentioned also that there was two other areas that I thought we should be addressing when we want to become more gospel-fluent people. Now, one of the areas I mentioned is spiritual warfare. The truth is, I don't want to overplay this or underplay this. I want to recognize that we are in a spiritual battle, that the powers that we are against have a spiritual element about them, but that as Christians we have a great assurance that God is for us and has gone before us. And so as a result we can be confident to continue, but I don't want to be unaware that these things might be happening around us. And so I think sometimes one of the reasons that we are not as able to have gospel fluent conversations is that there's spiritual warfare going on. And I suggest that maybe one of the ways that we start to address that is to pray together. I don't know if you've thought about the idea of praying for very particular things. Perhaps you start to say, well, I would like to have more gospel fluent conversations. That's a great start. I think that's an important thing to do. But what about if you said to yourself, okay, today I want to have 2 gospel fluent conversations, and I want to have them with my mum and with my friend at work. Father, will you help me have a gospel fluent conversation with each of those people, and will you help me deal with any of my fears or any of the things, circumstances around me which might prevent me from having that conversation? Can you see how that works? The idea of prayer, I think, is extremely important if we want to develop the ability to have gospel fluent conversations. Secondly, I mentioned the whole issue of motivations of the heart. Now, I think this is a much bigger area and a much more complex area, so I'm not going to say a lot about this. I'm going to recommend that you read the book again. But I want to suggest to you that sometimes when we're having conversations with people, what we hear is things about ourselves that go to our heart and cloud our responses, cloud the way that we might be able to respond. So for example, if my wife says to me, I didn't like the way you did that, I might suddenly feel like, oh, I'm a failure. And what I'm thinking about then is my failure, about my inability to do something well, that my wife might not like me, that somehow I'm not approved of. Perhaps you've had the same experience with a colleague at work when they've talked down to you, or a boss who's made you do something really hard, and all of a sudden your world is thrown about where you're starting to feel like you're not approved of, or somehow that you're not forgiven, or somehow you're not able to continue in a way that reflects what God has done for you. But the truth is, we know that Jesus has done all kinds of things for us, that in Christ on the cross we are approved of by God. And so as we address our issues of approval, when someone says something to us that perhaps is a bit negative or a bit of a concern, when someone does something that makes us concerned about our approval, we run to Christ and we say, how does the gospel speak to my heart at that particular moment? How does that help me with this situation? Yes, I might have said something that's inappropriate or unkind or unhelpful, but what does the gospel have to say about this? And so often by running to the gospel, what we then learn is how to respond. So we might be able to say to the person, yes, actually I admit that. I was a bit unkind in what I said, but what can I do to respond in a better way? What would help our relationship to develop at this point? How can I speak to you in a way that reflects who Jesus is calling me to be. Now imagine doing that. That would change the nature of the whole conversation in a radical kind of way. But you can only do that if you know that you are approved of in Christ already. And so the question is, what areas in your life are you struggling with? What areas do you need your heart to hear in regards to the gospel? What are things that are true about you that you need to hear for yourself? So for example, you might need to hear that you are cherished. You might need to hear that you're approved, that you're a beloved child of God, that you've been delivered, that you're not alone, that you're being transformed, that God is doing something wonderful in your life. There's all kinds of gospel truths that maybe your heart needs to hear. And so learning those and understanding those starts to address the issues of the heart, which then means out of your heart comes the conversations that you can have with other people. In a moment, we're going to think about one example of how we might start, or I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to ask you, how might you have a more gospel fluent conversation?